Rock For anyone who grew up belting out I Think I Love You along with him, it hurt to see how rough things got. Even so, he never totally walked away from the music. He kept getting on stage when he could, giving fans flashes of that charm that made him a star in the first place. David Cassidy passed away in 2017, way too soon honestly, but those old episodes and records still bring him back in an instant. Whenever you catch the Partridge Family, you can still think about how bright he once shined, and how hard it must have been to keep that light burning. Keith Moon. I don't think anybody else made drumming sound like a roller coaster ride quite like Keith Moon. Remember trying to keep up with him, just drumming on the steering wheel and then giving up, because Moon wasn't playing the same game as the rest of us. But off stage, the guy was a one-man wrecking crew, blowing up toilets, pulling pranks that bordered on assault, and of course that infamous car in the pool story we all heard like 100 times back in the day. The truth is, nobody seems to agree on exactly what happened at that Holiday Inn bash, but the wild bathroom explosions, oh, those were very real. But Moon's craziness wasn't just funny stories, it did have a dark side. In 1970, he tried to drive away from a nasty scene outside a pub, and his driver, Neil Boland, was tragically killed in all that chaos. Now, it was ruled an accident, but Moon carried the weight of that for the rest of his life. When you looked at him later in his life, you could kinda see it on his face, like the fun had gone from being wild to being haunted. And by the late 70s, he was running on fumes, but he still managed to show up for the Who's Who Are You album, and man, that cover still gives me chills to this day. Moon sitting in a chair that literally read, "Not to be taken away," and just weeks later he was gone. After taking too much of a prescription drug meant to help him kick booze, yeah, I know. No malice, just a heartbreaking end to the greatest madcap drummer rock had ever seen. And every time I hear that pounding beat on Who Are You, I can still feel his wild spirit alive and kicking, and of course, drumming. Ozzy Osbourne. When you think of Ozzy, it's impossible not to picture that wide-eyed frontman belting out Paranoid like his life depended on it. Black Sabbath had this dark, heavy sound that felt dangerous already, but Ozzy himself took it to a whole other level. Remember hearing those records for the first time and thinking this guy doesn't just sing the apocalypse, he is the apocalypse. And on stage or off, you never quite knew what he was going to do, and that unpredictability became part of his legend. Of course, the bat-biting story is the one everyone tells. What often gets lost, though, is that it wasn't planned. Someone threw a real bat onto the stage in 1982, and Ozzy kinda thought it was a prop until he clamped down. Before that, he had already shocked record execs by biting the heads off live dubs in a meeting. And in a mountain of booze and drugs, it seemed like Ozzy lived every day teetering on the edge of complete collapse. But here's the thing, somehow he made it through it. By the late 70s, Sabbath had fired him because he'd gone completely off the rails, and honestly, nobody expected him to bounce back. But then came the 80s and Blizzard of Oz, and suddenly Ozzy was bigger than ever. It was a sad day when Ozzy Osbourne left us in 2025, so please drop your favorite Ozzy Osbourne story in the comments section of this video. Andy Gibb. Andy Gibb is really what you would call a triple threat. He had it all: the voice, the looks, and that famous last name. He seemed destined to be a superstar from the start. His late 70s hits, like Shadow Dancing and I Just Want to Be Your Everything, they were everywhere, and it felt like he was the perfect fourth BG. For a while, it looked like Andy had the world at his feet. But behind all that success, things got rocky fast. Fame hit him hard, and he fell into the white stuff, up the nose, and it started derailing his career almost as soon as it took off. He would miss his own shows, he lost huge opportunities, and it even strained relationships. Marie Osmond once admitted she had to take legal action just to get him to stop calling. And the more the headlines came, the sadder they got, and you could tell the pressure of living up to the Gibb name was eating him alive. Andy Gibb tried to bounce back, taking TV gigs and working on new music, but the addiction never really fully let him go. By the early 80s, his career was fading, and his health was following that. Tragically, Andy Gibb died in 1988 at just 30 years old from heart failure linked to years of drug abuse. So the next time you hear Shadow Dancing, maybe think about that young, handsome kid with all the promise in the world, and just how quickly the bright lights can burn someone out. Sly Stone. If you grew up in the late 60s and early 70s, which you probably did, this is a nostalgia channel, you couldn't escape the joy of Sly and the Family Stone. I mean, look at this. Everyday People, Dance to the Music, Thank You. These songs were pure electricity, and they brought people of all walks of life together. Remember seeing them performing and thinking, man, this is what the future looks like. Colorful clothes, diverse band, and music that felt like freedom itself. Now Sly had the whole world dancing, but behind the curtain, things were getting messy fast. By the mid-70s, drugs had a hold on him, and the paranoia was following close behind. Stories began to float around about Sly missing gigs or disappearing altogether, sometimes leaving fans sitting in packed arenas with no show to watch. And when he did appear, he might show up hours late, stumble through a performance, or just walk off stage mid-performance. It was hard to watch. It was heartbreaking to watch. A genius at the height of his powers, slipping through the cracks. But still, Sly wasn't completely gone. In fact, he kept trying to stage comebacks, even popping up for surprise performances well into the 2000s. And whenever you hear the bass line of Thank You, you don't think about the chaos first. You think about that incredible wave of funk he unleashed on the world. The man's story may have taken some dark turns, but the groove he gave us has never stopped spinning. Syd Barrett. When Pink Floyd first started, Syd Barrett was the whole show, writing the songs, leading the band, giving them that trippy, otherworldly vibe. Tunes like Arnold Lane and See Emily Play, they were playful, strange, and fresh in a way that nothing else sounded at the time. Remember hearing The Piper at the Gates of Dawn and just sitting there wide-eyed trying to figure out what planet this music was from. Syd really was a genius in a way, but that flame burned way too hot. Sadly, we know this song and dance. Heavy LSD use and the pressures of fame started to take their toll just about immediately. So by the end of the 60s, he was showing up to gigs in a total daze, sometimes not even playing at all, or just basically strumming one chord the entire set. So the band had to bring in David Gilmour to cover for him, and by 1968, Syd was out of Pink Floyd entirely. His friends would talk about the paranoia and blank stares, and it was clear something inside him had gone quiet, something had broken. But even as he disappeared from the stage, his shadow loomed over the band's greatest work. Albums like Wish You Were Here and even parts of Dark Side of the Moon carried his ghost, like the songs Shine On You Crazy Diamond, written directly for him. Syd retreated into a private life back in Cambridge, painting and living quietly with his family, almost like that rock and roll story was a dream. But to this day, whenever I hear the opening notes of Shine On, I still feel that mix of awe and sadness for a friend they lost while he was still alive. Rod Stewart.
Oh, Maggie, I couldn't have tried anymore.
Rod Stewart might have had that raspy voice of gold, but back in the 70s, he also had a reputation for being just as wild offstage as he was magnetic on it. Songs like Maggie May and Tonight's the Night, they made him a superstar. He had that shaggy hair, the flashy suits, and that cheeky grin that made him look like trouble in the best way. And truth be told, he leaned right into that. Rod was a legendary partier in those years, and the stories piled up.
Tonight's the night.
He was known for drinking hard, getting into scraps at clubs, and brushing up against the law more than once. Fans saw him as a lovable rogue, but people who worked with him said he lived like every night was his last. Even with the chaos swirling around him, he somehow kept churning out hit after hit, almost like the mayhem gave him the fuel. Looking back, it's kind of amazing how he balanced it all. Plenty of rockers from that era burned out completely, but Rod managed to ride the wave and come out on the other side even stronger. He's still out there touring, soccer ball in hand, kicking it into the crowd like he always has. And every time I hear Do You Think I'm Sexy? I think of Rod Stewart in the 70s, half rock god, half party animal, and absolutely unforgettable. Janis Joplin. Janis Joplin had a voice that could tear your heart right out. Raw, soulful, and unlike anything else on the radio, then or ever. Remember the first time you heard Piece of My Heart? It felt like she was singing straight from her bones. Now Janis was the queen of counterculture, living fast, singing loud, and pouring out every ounce of herself into the songs. But off stage, Janis was caught up in heavy drinking and the H that only fueled her reputation as a hard-living wild child. Friends said she was either the life of the party or completely lost in the haze. And in 1970, she was gone at just 27 years old, found in a hotel room after an OD. So the next time you hear me and Bobby McGee, just think of that voice, so alive even if she never got the years she deserved. Brian Wilson.
I'm picking up good vibrations. She's giving me the...
Okay, close your eyes and think about summer in the 60s. Surfboards, hot rods, and those perfect Beach Boys harmonies floating out of car radios all around the globe. Brian Wilson was the genius behind it all, stacking those vocals like nobody else, and dreaming up Pet Sounds, which a lot of us consider one of the greatest albums ever. But by the time the 70s rolled around, Brian was slipping into a very different world. While the rest of the band kept smiling on stage, Brian was often nowhere to be seen. He spent much of that decade in his bedroom, barely leaving the bed, wrapped up in depression and blankets. The story goes that his weight ballooned, he lost interest in music, and he let an experimental therapist, Dr. Eugene Landy, take over huge parts of his life. His friends and family were worried, but Brian seemed locked away in his own mind. I remember people saying Brian was always out to lunch. And yet, as fragile as he was, the spark never fully went out, thank goodness. By the late 70s, he would step back in there. He contributed to projects, he tried to rejoin the world. Decades later, against all odds, he returned to the stage, even performing Pet Sounds in full for audiences who never thought they would hear it live. Brian Wilson, rest easy, man. Thank you for the music. Thank you for the memories. Peter Green.
Black magic woman, black magic woman.
Long before Fleetwood Mac was topping the charts with Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham, Peter Green was the band's driving force. He gave the band a bluesy backbone and even wrote Black Magic Woman before Santana made it a smash. Remember Then Play On? Those guitar lines just poured out like liquid gold, haunting, soulful, and unlike anything else. You see, Peter Green was one of those players who could make a single note feel like an entire story. But his life took a sharp turn after heavy LSD use in the late 60s. He became obsessed with religion and mysticism, convinced that money was evil, and even gave away most of his earnings. At one point, stories spread about him insisting that the band donate their profits to charity. And when they of course didn't, he drifted further and further from them. And by 1970, Peter Green had left Fleetwood Mac altogether, and the brilliant future everyone saw in him seemed to vanish overnight. Now, the years that followed were messy and sad. Mental illness, hospital stays, all while his old bandmates found worldwide success. Luckily, Peter Green eventually resurfaced, picking up the guitar again in the late 70s, and later leading the Spector group in the 90s. But I know whenever we all hear Albatross on the radio, you can't help but think about the road not taken. How, even in his darkest times, Peter Green left us with sounds that still feel otherworldly even today. Jim Morrison.
Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby.
Now, Jim Morrison had that voice that could sound like velvet one second and a thunderstorm the next. Songs like Light My Fire and Riders on the Storm made him feel larger than life, and to a lot of us, he was. He was the face of 60s counterculture. Remember hearing LA Woman for the first time and being absolutely floored? It sounded like Morrison was already half in another world, growling his way through those songs. He had the charisma, the poetry, and the danger, but by the end, the danger was starting to swallow him up whole.
Actor out on loan, riders on the storm.
You see, his drinking had gotten completely out of control, and it spilled into the concerts. There were shows where he stumbled around, slurring his way through his own songs and picking fights with the audience. He even got arrested on stage in Miami in 1969 for indecent exposure, though whether he actually did what they said is still debated to this day. But either way, his reputation went from mysterious poet to unpredictable loose cannon almost overnight. By 1971, Morrison had left the doors behind and moved to Paris, hoping to write poetry and escape the chaos. But the demons followed him there, and that summer he was found dead in his bathtub at just 27 years old. The mysterious part here was no autopsy was ever performed. So the next time you hear Riders on the Storm, think of Morrison in Paris, brilliant, broken, and gone far too soon. Bon Scott.
It's a long way to the top if you wanna rock and roll.
If there was ever a voice that could make you grin and wince at the same time, it was Bon Scott. Remember Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap? It sounded like Bon's voice had been soaked in whiskey and set on fire. He wasn't just singing the songs, he was living them full throttle every single night. And man, did he live hard. Bon was the kind of guy who could drink all night, charm the room, and still belt out a stadium show the next day. His partying was legendary. Booze, women, and raising hell wherever the band landed. Friends said he treated life like a never-ending pub crawl, and that kind of pace catches up with you, even if you seem invincible in your 20s and 30s. And by 1980, yeah, it finally did. After a night of heavy drinking, of course, in London, Bon passed out in a car and never woke up. The coroner ruled it alcohol poisoning, and just like that, AC/DC lost the voice that had powered them straight to the top. Whenever Highway to Hell comes on, I still think about Bon at the wheel. Laughing with that raspy cackle of his, headed down a road he probably knew might not last forever. Phil Spector. Most of us remember Phil Spector for that wall of sound he created back in the 60s. Huge, echoing productions that made songs like Be My Baby and You've Lost That Love and Feeling sound like they were built for the heavens. He was a genius in the studio, no doubt about it. But by the time the 70s rolled around, Spector's brilliance was tangled up in some very strange, dark behavior. Spector became notorious for pulling weapons out in recording sessions, waving them around to motivate artists or just make a point, I guess. Imagine trying to sing your heart out while the producer is waving around a revolver in the studio. I mean, no. Musicians like Leonard Cohen and even John Lennon worked with him and later admitted it could be terrifying. It was as if his paranoia had turned the studio, his old sanctuary, into a war zone. What's kinda chilling is those early stories were just the beginning. His reputation kept sliding, and while he'd pop up here and there, producing the Ramones into the century in 1980 for instance, his instability was hard to ignore. And decades later, his violence finally caught up with him in the most tragic way. If you didn't know this, strap in, because he landed in prison for murder. So the next time you hear the crashing drum at the start of Be My Baby, you might be torn between the awe of the sound he built and the unease over the man who built it. Jerry Lee Lewis.
The woman with the diamond ring, she knows how to shake that thing, alright.
Jerry Lee Lewis wasn't called the Killer for nothing. Back in the 50s, he set pianos on fire, literally, and pounded those keys like he was trying to break them. And by the time the 70s rolled around, you'd think maybe he would have calmed down a bit. But no, Jerry Lee just kept on living fast and loose. And off stage, things got a little more messy. He had run-ins with the law, plenty of drunken outbursts, and one infamous incident in 1976 where he accidentally shot his bass player in the chest. Now, miraculously, the guy survived, but that story followed Jerry Lee Lewis around like an old scar. Not long after, he actually showed out outside of Graceland with a gun, drunk and demanding to see Elvis, proving his reputation for danger wasn't a stage act. And yet, despite all that chaos, his career kept rolling. He shifted more into country music during the 70s, scoring big hits and reminding folks he wasn't just a rock and roll pioneer. He could croon too. Whenever I think of Jerry Lee Lewis, I picture that piano bench flying across the stage, him kicking it aside like it was holding him back. The man was trouble, the man was problematic, and he was unforgettable. Skip Spence. Now, Skip Spence is one of those names that doesn't come up as often as it should. But if you were deep in the San Francisco scene, you knew him. He played drums with Jefferson Airplane for a bit, and then co-founded Moby Grape, one of those bands that critics swore could have been as big as the Beatles if luck and timing had lined up. But terribly, in 1968, he suffered a psychotic break, fueled by LSD, and it turned violent. He showed up at a bandmate's hotel with an axe. Skip ended up in Bellevue Hospital for months, and when he got out, he tried a solo album called Or that barely made a ripple at the time. But honestly, nowadays, it's kind of being hailed as a lost classic. After that, his life unraveled through the 70s into a haze of hospitals, jail cells, and stretches of homelessness. It was heartbreaking to see someone so gifted vanish like that while the scene moved on without him. But still, even in the shadows, Skip left a mark. Musicians from Beck to Tom Waits have cited Orr as an influence, and fans rediscovered him long after his moment had passed. Whenever I hear those lonely, echoing songs, I can't help but think about the man behind them. So much talent, but a mind that just couldn't find peace. In a decade full of wild rock stories, Skip Spence's tale might be one of the saddest. Alice Cooper. Now, Alice Cooper was one of the guys who made you stop and stare, even if you weren't a fan of hard rock. His concerts in the 70s were like horror shows, fake blood, guillotines, electric chairs, snakes draped over his shoulders. Alice turned rock concerts into theater, and for a lot of kids, it was the most thrilling thing they'd ever seen. While the theatrics were carefully staged, the struggles off stage were very real. Alice was drinking so heavily at one point that it nearly killed him. He's been very open about downing cases of beer a day, and the toll showed. He looked worn down even while he was still selling at arenas. The line between the scary character he played on stage and the man behind it got blurred, and for a while it seemed like he might not make it out alive. The amazing part is he pulled through, and by the late 70s he checked himself into rehab. He eventually sobered up, and he didn't just survive, he thrived. He went on to influence everyone from Kiss to Marilyn Manson, and to this day, when Alice struts out with that black eyeliner and top hat, I can't help but smile, because underneath the makeup is a guy who beat his demons and proved that sometimes you can really cheat the guillotine. John Phillips. When you think of the Mamas and the Papas, you probably hear those dreamy harmonies of California Dreamin' or Monday Monday. They sounded like sunshine bottled into a song, and John Phillips was the main architect behind it. Back in the mid-60s, he was the mastermind writing those hits that defined a generation of folk pop. But as the years rolled on, that golden touch got buried under a mountain of horrible choices. By the 70s, Phillips was deep into drugs, H, the white stuff, you name it. His addiction became so consuming that by 1981, he testified before Congress about how badly drugs had wrecked his life. Yeah, the guy who once wrote chart toppers was now talking about losing everything in front of Congress. And it was hard to reconcile that image with the clean-cut songwriter fans remembered. But even worse, and many of you probably know this, years later, his daughter Mackenzie from One Day at a Time, the great sitcom, accused him of long-term sexual abuse, which cast an even darker shadow over his legacy. John tried to make comebacks here and there, including reunions with the Mamas and the Papas name, but the music was always overshadowed by the scandals. John Phillips passed away in 2001 after years of health struggles, and fans are still left wrestling with the two sides of his tale. The man behind California Dreamin' and the man accused of horrible acts. Man, the 70s gave us music that still shakes the walls today, but it also gave us cautionary tales we will never forget. So which of these stories do you remember the most, watching unfold back in the day? Which ones still blow your mind? And did I forget a great musical artist from the 70s who kinda lost their mind, lost their path? Well, get down in the comment section and tell me who. I could always make a round two. If you enjoyed the video, which we sure hope you did, please click that little thumbs up icon, it helps our channel a ton. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't get left behind. But most importantly, from my entire team here at Do You Remember, thank you so much for watching and have a wild and crazy day.